Hello everyone, today we talk about the Habsburgs. It's more than 1 year that have been introducing this sort of new series on Habsburgic history between the 17th and the 19th century. The reason being that I hadn't done so many videos on them before, like on Schwerpunkt I made so much content so far that, of course, it's great, but I tend to cover things in thorough detail, say within specifically narrow confines and a bit at a time. I haven't talked in general much about modern history per se. We talked about modern warfare a bit. In the last year I made a mini-series about princely Germany during the Middle Ages. Now I will also come back on the 30 Years' War soon. We had the distinguished honor of talking about, I don't know, the artillery of Maximilian I, for example, or other topics that definitely are connected to the enormous effort that, as we've seen, were always carried out by these politics, and that in the Habsburgic case, and this is what we're going to discuss today, however, took on very specific sort of historical and historiographical features that are interesting to analyze, because of course the series on the Habsburgs cannot, let's say, abstract from the scholarly understanding of, say, at least narratives that have been used properly to tell Habsburgic history. Given that we're going to arrive until the Congress of Vienna, and this could be a launch pad, as a matter of fact, for some more contemporary history of later, say, of the Habsburgic dynasty until the Habsburg-Lorraine at that point, since the 18th century, but fundamentally that's the continuum until the end of World War I. For that, we're also going to describe a bit more. We will look at the Austro-Hungarian army in action. This is not part of the entire Habsburgic playlist, but I really want to to pave the way with sort of very specific stones to, at least as a whole, cover the entire surface, and then further stratifying with more in-depth stuff, right? So that's my method. Bear with me. I appreciate your patience, and you will be rewarded for this at some point, at least. Every once in a while, it's good to present something sort of more broad-scoped in order to frame the bigger picture. I never liked, let's say, historically, to just concentrate on specific things without telling with the essentials about the entire background. This is a problem of our current way to make history from a couple of generations, unfortunately, and the future does not seem to be particularly bright. There is a real decadence. It's not just the idea of I'm getting old, and so I think that everything coming newly is bad and terrible and dangerous or whatever. It is really a matter of fact. Like, I actually went through, like, say, the same academic path, criticizing this heavily since the beginning. It's something I sort of mounted within me because of the general observation of our world as a whole. And talking about the Habsburgs, I think, is a very crucial catalyst for this process. Like, it's one of those dynasties that really have everything in their past, and just by scale of, say, prestige and of balanced role and sort of, overall European and Mytholo-European, or so this, as you know, in Schwerpunkt, we tend to insist on the concept of Central Europe, properly separated from the Western one, as in a specificity that, however, tends to encompass, as a compass, the entirety of Western history. And I'm also aware, of course, to be talking to a largely Anglo-American audience that, in this sense, is more detached in a way in another from this topic. I can say that a good part of my ancestors were proud Habsburgic subjects at some point, and this is relevant to me, like, meaning that I come from a background that also sort of really embraces the deepest meaning of the empire, for example, but the empire also meaning properly the Holy Roman one, and a perspective that is not out there popularly. We definitely live, and there are pros and cons of this, as you know, and I always say it whenever I touch on this topic. I criticize, as you know, pretty much everything and everyone, right? And yet I have a positive idea of the foundational characteristics of Anglo-American culture. I do see them fully within the, say, as a product, one of the other, actually, within probably the truest European sense. There is a sort of more islander background. There is surely, like, you know, it depends on how back in time you go in terms of things like, for example, the Reformation, etc. And things change. It is not to say that these are not important, but this is not the video in which we're going to discuss it. But as you know, Schwerpunkt, I've tried to promote as much as possible the sort of, at least the importance of having an awareness of the traditional meaning of European values. That is not merely what the average layman thinks of as conservative ideals. It's something extremely deeper that, unfortunately, that escapes the mental confines of most people that are themselves conservatives, that think that for some reason they're qualified to talk about this deeper sense. Today we will sort of straddle different and pretty large times and places. So this is not really going to be an easy video in general, because of the general level of approximation. But we will essentially try to observe some characteristics, at least, of the Habsburgic rule, for how they historically were. We sort of think that they historically were, and that will be sort of highlighted in the rest of course, the Habsburgic history videos that I'm gonna make. On the previous videos, I emphasized mostly the composite nature of Habsburgic domains. That, in many ways, it's also one of the most relatively, say, acknowledged and but by everyone characteristics of the Habsburgic Empire and the sort of this multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilinguistical dominion that was definitely more difficult to control because of such diversity. There is no doubt about this, right? In many ways, there are scholars that say, no, this was actually a strength, and or the Habsburgic subjects were somehow accustomed to that, and just later on, from especially the 19th century, they took on a more strictly nationalistic, ethno-nationalistic stance that was aimed at, even within the space of this sort of, as it was named, we'll see later why, Austrian clemency. They were trying essentially to break free and to have their own country for themselves. The point of this vision is typical one, let's say, of the later, say, if you want, post-World War II, or at least I hate to say that, but a bit more of this sort of, like, before nationalism, there weren't actually, say, antagonistically operating national identities, right? And it's all about the 19th century. You know that as a traditionalist, I see nationalism as just the last step before communism, right? It was literally born, and who knows Habsburgic history knows this very well, as a radical, leftistic, terroristic, fourth estater, lesser people ideology that was primarily countering, actually, properly, like, the right of the nobility, properly of the aristocrats to rule. And so in many ways, in the Habsburgic Empire, aside from of course, Napoleon's secularization, it was a product of the same nationalism to an extent, brought to, let's say, still the Habsburgs maintaining a bit the banner of that imperial continuity, not truly a Holy Roman anymore, but still bearing the symbols of the eagle, of the let's say of the general role and valorial system that older might had really been. And that's the bigger question, what to do all of it, right? Because if you're distracted by nationalism, not to literally collocate nations within the universal, ecumenic, imperial order and hierarchy, we do have a problem, right? And there is indeed much that changed especially towards the second half of the 19th century within the same Austria. It is true that sort of ethno-nationalism, also pan-Germanism, in that sense, also in actually a very self-sabotaging way as far as the Habsburgs were concerned, because as you know, there was say the system, the Doppelmonarchie actually occurred because of the defeat against Prussia that went on unifying Germany, whereas Austria was essentially obliged not just to stand aside, having had the option to do that at different times in history, but actually sharing an equal ground with the Hungarians. So it's pretty difficult, pretty difficult topics to discuss, especially for those involved. Like if you talk about this just from a strictly nationalistic point of view, aside from all the socialistic implications that of course always existed within nationalism for the aforementioned reasons, many people are totally dissonant towards this realization. You have like this video being used just for stamping one another, depending whichever background, whichever political idea you have, really. And when you talk about certain ethnicities, especially like from one side of the aisle, we look at all the videos. I can't say which ones, but you know exactly which videos are of mine, by the way. Not only are the most watched and what kind of comments that I actually let running freely just to get more views and boosting, because even going against my own policy regarding the comments and the censorship that I administrate, because it's objectively funny and you understand a lot of things from people's psychology, not from their history or whatever, also from that, but that's not a surprise for everyone, but mirroring the actual psychological cases that exist in the world to this day, and observing literally the psychiatric trauma that the world has received out of the destruction of tradition. Now, aside from that, of course, there is a more nuanced and also shaded sense of how the Habsburgs have really been represented. This was the idea of a government ruling over such different states, or such sort of diverse state within itself with so many different peoples, etc., and securing support from domestic elites and foreign allies in this, great balanced game that was, in fact, much more equilibristic than the one of Europe's highly, but at least more centralized and so-called absolute monarchies. That's also unfair. There are so many wrong definitions. No monarchy, no power was ever absolute before actually the end of what we call absolute monarchies, right? That absolute power was reached only under Napoleon, with the Code Napoleon, where the state becomes the sole source of law. The Habsburgs, actually, in the 18th century, were some of the most, let's say, built monarchies in Europe, indeed with this very different background compared to others, like the French one, for example. But we tend to categorize too much in terms of few indicators and not realizing necessarily what power, for example, of avocation the Habsburgs had achieved in the 18th century, just like the Hohenzollern, for example, as well. And there is a sense I'm talking about general sort of pop culture and or broader historiographical attitude and or like it can be my impression to some extent, of course, an unfavorable comparison made between the Habsburgs and other dynasties. It's as if the Habsburgs had been portrayed as a group of principled, conscientious, pious, and exceptionally moral individuals, or at least sort of trying to behave like that to compensate for their lack of, say, concrete, direct political territorial control compared to other more built-up monarchies. But in this sense, also having, at least in the myth that developed from this vision, like lacking the foresight and decisiveness necessary to align their monarchy with the other great powers of the continent. And as a military historian, you definitely get that, right? Because of what, for example, Germany became historically, there is the sense that, I don't know, that the Austrians, in comparison, albeit being Germans themselves, to be honest, I mean, not making the pan-Germanistic sense, but hey, like, I'm a medievalist, so Austria is, Kingdom of Germany, end of the story. And that's actually how the real thing really was. But I mean, the Germanness, the Prussianness, right, was seen as irremediably just something tougher and cooler and sort of more, say harder and less, more successful and less compromising at the same time. That sort of made it where the Habsburgs failed. And part of this is even true. Right, but in the great comparison of 18th century armies, like, or in the Napoleonic era, the Austrians always pass, also by Napoleon saying a people without much of an ingenuity, of some sort of mild, if you want, almost not necessarily gentle, but a bit romantic, and this sense by stopping to smell the roses of just not even moving from there. In a world that was changing faster than this sort of gentler tradition and Viennese dances and music would have liked to make them think. And this is not really comparable with other powers, but it's a bit like the idea of the Great Decline, right? The Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburgs have been criticized historiographically for allowing the monarchy to enter a sort of gradual but steady decline, allegedly, a trajectory beginning with the reign of Charles V and culminating in its collapse during the First World War. Well, it took 400 years, like it's not really that quick, definitely, in a world, by the way, that was really changing and having a lot at stake. Definitely, there is a broader philosophy of history that I also am familiar with and sometimes use for my videos for how I see it, stressing, especially as a military historian, the moment of the crisis, right? The balance of the odds. And the fact that indeed every polity actually at the time was on the brink of collapse in a way or another. On the other hand, you can't unsee the civilizational continuity that such powers really had, right? It's not a matter of like why would, for example, the Habsburgic dynasty would have brought to a collapse practically of their own domains with a constant attitude throughout all these centuries till their final end, right? It doesn't make much sense. And one should focus also indeed on the reasons why the subjects were such, right? As always, there is no such government possible in any circumstances without the decisive moral support of the people. And as a medievalist especially, like you come to understand why the older, like traditional model of lordship, for example, was so consensual, as a matter of fact, which is a point that the average person today does not even contemplate because they have problems probably with the idea of power in a metaphysical sense, and they essentially think to live in a world where there are few evil people who rule. Nobody knows with which actual connection with the will of human beings, in spite of the fact that civilization also skyrocketed, dramatically increasing the wealth and to much extent the actual liberty. At least there are fluctuations of this over time of human beings that, however, seem to be in fact the ones that trigger the crisis, that sort of get mentally exhausted even though they have actually all the means to really work, and betraying actually laziness and eventually acting as superstitious, paranoid victims of a system that it could simply change by being decent people, as a matter of fact, and that instead is irremediably rigged by some people that is always the others. And of course, the average person has never a fault of any of that. And understanding why, of course, the Habsburgic Empire, in all its complexity and diversity and moments of crisis that repeated themselves over the centuries, managed actually to remain together. And this is, again, not really denying the actual divides that existed within it. I mean, there is that series made on the siege of Vienna in the broader, say, political, diplomatic, international background of the situation that really tells you like the incredible sort of farraginous, complicated, and inefficient mechanism that was at play when seen within the same Habsburgic system, but this wasn't really enormously different in terms of possibilities of instability compared to, I don't know, for example, the Ottoman Empire, that at times when it was engulfed by much bigger crises and was in some ways also a much more complex and diverse system than that one. But you never hear sort of the complaint, oh my God, the Ottoman Empire was so backwards and it was so mixed, and the Ottomans used clemency, etc. In many ways, these are actually the same tools that were used to define the Habsburgic, say the same reasons why they were used to define the Habsburgic empire, and that you understand that are getting applied just to it, or at least through different narratives depending on who the power is and what kind of perception we have of the same over time. So of course you understand that we're going to sort of analyze and to sort out a bit this empire tentatively during our series, exactly to really answer the question that every historian really has, like what was really this system like, right? And trying to go also a bit beyond this, it depends, or it's complex, you can't really find the answer, you have to think rather in this relative term. No, we want the actual real objective sort of reliable assessment of what this thing really was. Naturally, it takes time. It's not simple at all. It's hard, but this is the point of history, that what we're here for. You see, the same Austrian scholars at some point bought into this idea of the Habsburgs as being a bit sort of more gentle-souled or moderate, or even to the point of irresolution, like this is not a compliment, right? This sort of half measures, right, as part of the so-called Austrian clemency. And so giving all that touch of tenderness to this rule. Even the color, like the normal white with gold we associated with the empire, with is sort of providing us emotionally, psychologically. These things do make that difference. There was surely a meaning behind that, exactly with this purpose as well, right? We know, of course, I'm not making the point that, okay, so the Habsburgs were evil, were resolute, were decisive. No, it's not the point either, right? Even when in the 19th century, of course, they got way more reactionary and repressive, they turned into some sort of police state, but those were also the times, in fact, of the age of revolutions. There were massive threats. You have always to contextualize that. When I would say this, rather, that when you look at Habsburgic history and I do have, again, a lot of that especially warfare side of the story inside for further videos in the future, you realize that this power was not actually less tenacious or aggressive than others, right? They were capable of determination, arrogance, intolerance, brutality, and this is, again, all part of what the government normally does and must do, right, to some extent. And it's exactly the aforementioned, like, sort of allegedly long death of this system that makes you actually see how, exactly because of some deficits that this system really had compared to Western European monarchies, institutionally speaking, like, that makes it all the more striking to observe in its success, right? How could the system that apparently was so, again, old-fashioned, less developed, it is true, right? In general, Central Europe, the same Austria, wasn't particularly developed. Like the 18th, 19th century, the most developed part of the empire was Lombardy, right? There are some, definitive answers to give in order to explain how the system really worked, but indeed, like, if this system worked for so much, for so long, and managed to cover this immense territory with so many different people, the question is, wasn't there something really positive going on? Wasn't there positive in the sense of achievement, of success, of actually nailing it from a political and governmental point of view? And there is no doubt that this was also, as we will see now, due to compromise. That ultimately did undermine the empire, but you could never really tell at different turns of history actually that this was necessarily like the worst thing. It was like more, of course, the product of circumstances, but also at some point could have really brought this power further and even not end, right? Which is, that I don't like what ifs, because I think that what happened in reality just by itself is more important than anything else. But exactly because it happened in reality, it's also something you can actually explain because of the historical evidence. There is an interesting comparison, by the way, that I'm not sure how much we will be making, because at the end of the day, these two chunks of the Habsburgic dynasty separated in a broader sense than just, say, biologically. Aside from the intermarriage. And that is the degree by which, for example, the Black Legion affected differently, by the way, the Spanish and the Austrians, right? And this channel, that there is, as I said at the beginning, some sort of more Catholic, Central, Southern European sort of vision of what happened, especially during the 16th and the 17th century, that you can appreciate in more sort of traditional ways in relation to Protestantism. I never made a single video about the Black Legion, but it would be really one of the most important to make, because yes, as a whole, like, if you pick like the entire sort of global historical awareness, the Black Legion is still strongly affecting the way we look at history. There's no doubt. Right, it's not the problem of these prejudices. It's not much that the people don't understand being such, but still the fact that because of that, history, and so the history that even these people know has been selectively explained, has been just has been orientating them towards directions, preferences, visions, opinions, interests, etc. that undermined the capacity to understand the other side. As you know, on this channel, I also have a general... I try to be fair and objective as much as I can, because that's the thing that I care about the most, because I like history and I couldn't do it otherwise for this reason. But I have like some specific, Protestant leaders that I thought were great rulers and that succeeded heavily, even when and where the Catholics did fail. So it's not like I'm trying to flip the narrative of, oh my god, so now we should just switch team and because our own is cooler. That I don't make history like that and say old date followers know that I refrain from that. I don't have actually any reason to do so, and it wouldn't be funny for me either, frankly. And the aspect is interesting because you see how multi-layered it is. Spain received a terrible press in so many ways, whereas the Habsburgs of Austria sort of a bit past that. I don't want to try to find the reasons. There may be some, I don't know, maybe in racial bias, there may be some sort of more innerly European, typicity in the Central European, even aesthetics to some degree to this day, that, I don't know, think about how many people are obsessed with late 19th century Vienna, even just touristically wise, and, I don't know, Baroque Spain, the Spain of Olivares, or, there are different sort of ways we describe ourselves, we see ourselves, we like to think of our past, and focusing on that, I have, I have definitely a much greater connection myself to the direction rather than the other, but and it's normal, right? The problem is that this shouldn't come at the cost of historical objectivity for some reason. Spain, in a sense, in spite of the enormous power that in this sense the Black Legion did not really want to celebrate in its concreteness, there was really striking in a historical perspective, was at the same time somewhat isolated. This is really true. You see it since the Middle Ages. Yes, the Spanish were in Flanders, they were in Italy. They intervene in North Africa, but mostly, their greatest accomplishment was in the Americas, and their empire became, in fact, a competitive one, also with the British, that more or less dictated, even just as a legacy, our own view, worldview in a way of seeing history as Westerners, and that's a completely different world, a sort of more exotic one, sort of more, even detached, like in the far west of Europe, from the very heart, right, that you can sort of geographically and culturally locate in Rome, Paris, or Prague. And so in a dimension that is, in fact, also often more intertwined, and for longer periods of time, it is often sort of also neglected. I mean, let's be honest, France, Italy, also Germany as a whole, not just Austria, are a bit still today the backbone of, for example, the European Union, what came out as a broader historical legacy since, you can argue, I don't know, Carolingian times, the famous phrase of Charlemagne, father of Europe. It's not, let's say, there is definitely a Europe was fathered by Charlemagne, but there is, of course, more to that, and Spain definitely contributed massively as well. It's not to say to isolate it, but in fact, in her own specific way. With the Habsburgs, you have this empire straggling central, parts even western, if you consider, for example, the Habsburgic Netherlands, Habsburgic Flanders, the Balkans, Southern Europe. You have really lots of different peoples speaking different languages from different, properly, stocks of the Indo-European ones that were all under the Habsburgic rule. And the sense that the Habsburgs were also a bit isolated, a bit sheltered from the major European upheavals, especially in the first part of their reign, is a bit sort of yet another myth, right? The fact that indeed, around the 16th century, especially the first part, this depending also on the consistency of the rule, the Habsburgs were a bit more isolated. Like, there wasn't like a major power bordering them that was threatening the core of Austria. If you actually see the Ottoman projection capacities, if you look at the first siege of Vienna, you can immediately see how this is not driven for that era, but that's also a bit exceptional. And definitely, and this is a process that starts from the Middle Ages. We've made multiple videos starting from the origins of the dynasty, like a very prolonged time in which these Alpländer and the other Habsburgic possessions sort of sedimented, stratified, took their time. I mean, this mostly like fragmented Germany that, as we've seen, was such a complicated system that barely anyone sort of ever even decided to simply conquer, right? You have, during the 30 Years' War, definitely armies from all over crossing it, devastating it, but you don't really have even the stability, for example, that the Italian regional states more or less maintained during the early modern era, even under foreign dynasties. Germany is such a complex system that in its Sonderweg is, in this sense, still to sort out all by itself. Like, if this is just a presentation for the Habsburgs, one has to think there, oh boy, like, what was the role of the Germans in their Renovatio Imperii? That's something we have to heavily discuss. We can't simply escape that on Schwerpunkt. I'm preparing something about that too, right? But going back to the Habsburgs, there are definitely instances in which they were, like, I'm talking properly before, within the confines of what I wanted to discuss before the Congress of Vienna, moments which they did impose themselves, and such excessive behavior did backfire. Right, this happens again in every country, with every government, and in that case, like, it forced the Habsburgs also to retreat hastily. Right, so this is just for saying that the myth of the Austrian clemency definitely has nothing to do with some sort of uniquely humane or submissive disposition linked to dynasty. Right? I'm convinced that, again, even figures like Joseph II really left a mark in our perception of, oh my god, the Habsburgs were so progressive or so tolerant, even too much, as a matter of fact. This is what Maria Theresia thought of her son's ideas as well, even though, of course, she was seen already as too much bit of a not liberal reformer, but definitely something that, yes, comparatively to other monarchies at the time, was going towards at least an unprecedented direction. And we'll see now why and how. I have an enormous myth about Maria Theresia, so don't touch her, otherwise I will find you and I will it will not end well. I broke down in tears in the Kapuziner Kirche in front of her tomb. There is indeed, in fact, from figures like these great rulers, a pragmatic strategy to maintain relationships with the domestic elites and foreign allies that, of course, were necessary to afford the monarchy its greatest stability. And so it's the peculiar circumstances that, aside from a legacy, a continuity, even a spirit that surely the dynasty had, in a way, would have eventually made the history that we know. The Habsburgs had really to be that careful, and we will partly explain why. Surely there were some few, but of course, personal qualities that the Habsburgs shared. For example, their conscientiousness and piety. Right, but these were also traits which were necessary, were sort of part of their education, their upbringing, like the general temper that the House of Austria had also cultivated, having, for example, less riches, not having really a saint in their family. This would be a problem historically, and therefore say, adapting to this a more modest background, really the 16th to 17th century Habsburgs weren't really this enormously powerful, say, rulers compared to others. At least they had a much more machinous system that they could stretch just to so much. This would bring them to show this greater piety, this greater sense of balance, of hearing like different sides, negotiating with the local elites. And of course, this is not to say that this cannot be transformative in a constitutional way, even just about the actual dynasty, semantically speaking. But of course, it was also made. It depended on the rulers, made different choices, had different attitudes. Think about Leopold I and then Joseph I and Charles VI, right? The relation with Prince Eugene, for example. What if Joseph I had lived? It would have been really a hell of an Habsburg, right? Frederick II, as you know, joked about the fact of Maria Theresia as a hell of a ruler being like the true emperor, meaning like the male ruler that the Habsburgs had ever had, as a matter of fact. And surely there are some odd aspects of this dynasty as well, like any other. Every polity had their fundamental issues. Their ruling dynasties had always something to sort of do, to mask, to sort of be envious towards others for, and whatever. The Habsburgs were also not, of course, merely average rulers at all. They were Holy Roman Emperors, and I'm not going to even repeat what that means historically and politically and institutionally, not just for Germany, but for Europe, even those territories that were not part historically of how the Holy Roman Empire had come to be structured at this point in a more, say, limitedly territorial way. Definitely the moment at which the Habsburgs sort of consolidate their power and become really a regional might is the 16th century, right? In the early 16th century in particular, Maximilian, Charles, Ferdinand really incarnate like a revived power that had recompacted essentially from the mid-15th century that really manages to carry out a pretty large-scale policy, again, regional in scale. We've seen in the video about the Italian wars how sort of the German armies weren't particularly performing compared to, say, the Spanish, the French, the Swiss ones even, to some extent. And that's, of course, an issue that actually mirrors the limited resources that Austria, I'm approximating, of course, with all her dependencies, really had at the time. And it's still essentially feudal nature of the same. Like, I mean, even the same Vienna wouldn't be a real capital until the mid-17th century. Like, it's not like we can simply pretend that there was a modern era that magically ended the Middle Ages. It was the same medieval world that, especially in the Habsburgic one in Mitteleuropa and a bit beyond also, survived in ways that locally were completely normal, also in terms of mindset and, say, points of references, of referencing politically, culturally, even militarily to some extent. There is all an anthropology, a worldview really connected with this. Even, of course, the religious tradition is different. The Turk, in many ways, defined what Central Europe, for example, was, to an extent that people in the West can not really fully understand if they're not from those countries. Now, from sort of the consolidation of the monarchy in the 16th century, the Habsburgs encounter the formidable challenge, of course, of governing a diverse and complex dynastic state that was not that particularly easy to defend. We observed before that, especially at this time, there wasn't any major power next door. But it is true that exactly for this reason, the same Habsburgic frontiers were quite permeable, because there wasn't really a bulwark, other than, say, what the Habsburg could put together themselves, preventing, in fact, any other power to interfere into those areas. This would be actually a great problem. You hardly see ever massive invasion of the Habsburgic territory until later in time, unless we talk about the Ottoman aims on Vienna, that were really exceptional. In hindsight, in perspective, it's, you know, the Ottomans could have, in theory, marched even on Warsaw, right? Not following the Danubian, but the Vistula Valley. There was all a set of options, right, that eventually brought Vienna to be that exposed. But paradoxically, the Habsburgic problem was this liminal fluctuation, for which they were technically the Holy Roman Emperors and kings of Germany, but they could hardly control even the majority of such territory that was instead more steeply fracturing, especially since the Reformation and the obvious realization that some Protestant Germans preferred to be literally ruled by the French king into Germany than helping the Habsburgs against the Ottomans, and actually favoring the latter. So a pretty messed up situation that does not really find many parallels, right? There was always some sort of strange bad partnership, some strange triangles, but overall, some other systems were much more sort of unitarily oriented towards this, say at a regional, national level alignment or not. All right. So there were, we've seen it often in the videos about 1683, many different factions, say of ambassadors and other representatives at the Habsburgic court, exactly because this permeability of this broader Central European space really made the Habsburgs a bit like the tip of the balance in many ways. And so there were so many also non-obvious and ever-changing parties that were trying to convince the emperor to make war, I don't know, in Hungary against the Turks rather than in Germany against the French. And many other, that's just some of the examples. Had it been really just so simple, it wasn't at all, right? The Poles had aims on the Hungarian crown that the Habsburgs controlled. There were Protestant princes in Central Europe, say beyond Germany. There was like all the let's say the issues with Venice at a point. So not an easy one, and even a competition actually with the Spanish, and or at least like some sort of dissonance between the interests of Spain that were mostly naval, right, Mediterranean, whereas of course the Habsburgic ones were much more terrestrial, Central European, and much more directly concerned of the Ottoman land capacities as well. So imagine just in this, we should point out that actually very crucial to say the least was the finally reacquired after the turmoils of the Italian wars and all sort of the Guelph Ghibelline struggle during the Middle Ages, the solid, stable alliance between the Habsburgs and the papacy. The papacy contributed gigantically, but I mean gigantically, from a financial point of view, to fund crusades, to really fight the Turks in a much more direct sense. Objectively, the Habsburgs, say Austria and Italy, were sort of the most directly involved powers against the Ottomans. Even in that case, mostly on different theaters, the Italians at sea, the Austrians on land mostly. respectively. But truly there was a unity of intents that is definitely displayed in the moments in which there was to rise an army, as we've seen in 1683, putting together the forces, convincing the various rulers, amidst this incredibly petty differences in a moment of such great danger for everybody involved, that you must really thank St. Peter for. And also to an imperial degree. In fact, I have yet another surprise incoming. I'm preparing lots of specials, as a matter of fact, of the Italian contribution, for example, to the 30 Years' War. The sense that there was an actual Holy Roman Empire. I would say that the more modern and secular way of teaching Habsburgic history, it's the Austrians, basically, in a sort of proto-nationalistic sense, and thinking that the empire was over well before the secularization, that nobody really believed in that stuff. It was changed. It's modern era now. So no, right? There was an incredibly intense awareness from the side of the Italians, of the Czechs, or of some of all the peoples, even part of the Hungarians, of course, and more, albeit these latter not being part of the Holy Roman Empires, but of the necessity of a loyalty, not to simply a dynasty, but to the Holy Roman Empire. That is not just a name or whatever. Like, I know I have the pleasure of knowing some of the leading researchers that exactly for the late 15th, beginning of the 16th century study the existence of a Ghibelline party that was not at all banished or just a relic of some alleged feudal anarchy of the previous, struggle between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, of the previous centuries. There was, up to very recently in times, if you read many works, of course, the ones that were printed in the empire for the emperors, of course, the utmost loyalty towards the latter, right? For medievalists, that before the Monumenta Germania Historica or the works of other illustrious European, let's say, collections of medieval sources, the very first one was carried out in northern Italy by Ludovico Antonio Muratori. That's really the founder, in fact, of one branch of medievalistics in this regard, that, of course, published his works as a gift to Charles VI, as a gift to Maria Theresia, right? As emperors, as imperial majesties that still, we're close times, talking about the end of the 17th, the beginning of the 18th century, right? That are so close to us, right? This is not a faraway time, and the prevalent mindset was really, this is how the system really is. Like, there is not even for how fast the world would change later, of course, for reasons that brought that to be. So, like, it's striking how that mindset was so natural and normal and obvious, and really the only one possible, really, up to so late in time, and without, I would say, even many other options in a political sense, but not in terms of with whom do you side, but literally in a metaphysical, also religious one, right? But going back to the compaction of also a more markedly Austrian power as the core of Habsburgic rule, of course, there was this time of grado, especially in the first centuries of the modern era, let's say, not just holding on such territories, but the work to diligently strengthen the local state and address the weaknesses inherited from, let's say, the early rulers, say from Ferdinand's reign, if we want to talk about the modern era. And so, through persistent effort, the Habsburgs implement cohesive policies across their lands that will manage to foster a sense of unity that might otherwise have being absent, right? You don't have to give it for granted. The Habsburgs are a relative novelty in the realm of regional power, right? Remember, they emerged from Germany, where it had been really the princely rule to inherit most of the the ever-changing princely rule, mostly provincial in scale, that had been swinging also with the extinction of families like, in fact, the Luxembourgs. Yes, the Habsburgs had always sort of been in between. They had, since the late 13th century, definitely installed themselves in southeastern Germany. That was their abode. But as you know, they also fragmented in different branches, and it wasn't to be given for granted that they would have existed as a regional power up to fairly late in time, and just also for some dynastic accident after all. It is true, of course, that there is also in the later Middle Ages a process of great work. In fact, this is really included in the process I was describing, but we have, as medievalists, to discuss this way more in depth in some other videos, of course, for which, of course, there is a sense that, I don't know, this lord has really taken over, right? That some local forces have been curbed, they have been, they are complying to this order and structure in it. We've seen new institutions also for the entire Germany, the Reichskammergericht, let's say, the way of recognizing, for example, the Habsburgic continuity in the Holy Roman Imperial election, which is yet another thing that shouldn't simply be given for granted, because it wasn't even at some point. So we will have the mean to see how, of course, which rulers did what, who contributed more or less to the Habsburgic monarchy's development, right? But all left substantial challenges for their successors to tackle. This is really the normality. It's just a matter of how much they would go with it, because the world changes. It's not just an internal problem. You have to compete, and that the methods of stylus actually helps a lot to confer power to the leaders, structuring the state, finding the means to levy an army worth of this name, etc. There are crises during Habsburgic history that we will see a bit more in depth some other time, referring 1618 to 20, and also like the general outcome of that in the following decades. 1683, it was really a very close call. Then you have 1703, 1704, 1741, 1740, 1741. You have there like probably actually a dynastic change, as you know, with the Lorraine. You have 1790, you have 1809, 1810. Do you like the Battle of Wagram? And you know that's something we have to definitely cover. We have 1848-49. That was really scary and bad and brutal and violent and terrible. And of course, the even more painful 1916-1918, which we will perhaps talk about sooner than you think. So, interestingly enough, and also because some of these crises had to do with the same monarch's right to rule, only two of the aforementioned crises actually coincided with the transition between one monarch's reign and another. Actually, the Habsburgs were tough, right? They actually put up a dramatic struggle against any attempt to undermine the rule. It's not like they weren't literally risking everything to crumble, right? We've seen it too well for 1683, but there are dramatic situations later on. So the reasons would be surely the escalation of unresolved issues or mistakes, as always, That's why we make this series in the first place. And the fact that the monarchy's leaders effectively addressed nearly all of these challenges, save for the last, which was in many ways sort of unaddressable, because essentially Austria-Hungary had sort of even lost much of its suzerainty in those circumstances, demonstrate their, say, the Habsburgic monarchic competence. This like final case underscores the high stakes involved. Of course, it's not like Franz-Joseph wasn't a great ruler at all. We will focus mostly on the 16th, 17th, 18th century crises. And we will deal with the steps that the Habsburgic monarchy took along the way, showing how, yes, you can step further with great effort and pain and losses, etc. But then, once you reach the next stage, there is yet another challenge. And this is really how civilization steps up. And what is interesting, of course, is that the Habsburgs did contribute to the development of other powers in the same way, even within their own dominion. Now, clearly, the greatest problem that plagued the empire and obstructed German unity, which was originally especially the sort of greatest issue, right, of the Habsburgs, made it all the more crucial for the dynasty to complete the state-building process within its own territories. As you know, essentially the Habsburgs start as a German power and end up essentially to form an empire that has more territories outside of Germany than within. The same actually can be said for the Hohenzollern, Prussia. And the reasons were a bit the same, actually. Not just, of course, they were interfering with one another, but Germany was in many ways too intricate of a labyrinth to enter in with too few gains. For at least considering the international attention towards the possibility of power just to seize everything. That's how the Habsburgs essentially failed during the 30 Years' War, for example. Everybody entered the playroom. One major problem that would define the Habsburgic rule as a whole throughout the centuries is that in order to create a cohesive state, they had to transform essentially their disparate possessions. And so, in the process, trying, at least, to dismantle the existing political, administrative, and cultural barriers. This was actually not possible to be done. Like, none of, say, the Austrian, the Bohemian, the Hungarian establishments would have allowed that. Also, the Habsburgs themselves had to gain from actually maintaining a semblance of the previous order, like pointing out that they were the legitimate ruler of not just the Holy Roman Empire, but of something greater that in this sense, however, was shifting its center of gravity outside of Germany, and so internationally making others question what kind of legitimacy this was founded on. Naturally, there was a legitimacy traditionally, in as much as, say, we shouldn't reason much in terms of states, but of countries and their laws, and say the dynasty that the locals called to rule, to have their customs respected, justice to be administered, and say enemies being fenced off, right? Internal peace restored. This was actually like sort of not to change. What paradoxically Austria was blessed by, at least to a degree, depending to standards, is how developed some of its possessions really were. I mean, it was actually easier to co-opt sort of more compact states than, say, in fact, trying to mold this feudal forest. But most of what the Habsburgs ruled on was exactly this one, right? And some sort of failed states like Hungary in historical perspective. No wonders why, for example, they fought so much for Lombardy. That was instead of much more tightly, was one of the most advanced regions in Europe. It's a bit like, I don't know, that there are parallels of this kind also in history, like Warsaw for the Tsarist Empire. And so there are other moral also factors at play. There was, for example, a different degree of growth, of expansion compared to other areas. Prussia, for example, was much more backwards historically. In some areas, Frederick the Great said, like, were less developed than Siberia. But even in that, there was some sort of primitive, brutal, say, more genuine force that was sort of emerging with new powers in the second modern era that sort of wouldn't be this enormously, in fact, developed ones, but were sort of newer races, and they had their moment, right, in the rise to power, and still, however, trying to grab as much as they could. The Habsburgs couldn't quite simply unbalance themselves so much, right? They could, of course, and would get lots of territories, for example, after the wars of the Spanish succession, but at the same time, they never really tried to attempt some sort of major, let's say, invasions that weren't at least happening when another establishment was crumbling, like, for example, after the victory at Vienna from the Ottoman side, and still in territories that were particularly underdeveloped in perspective. So it's difficult to follow a single thread by explaining this. There was a very sort of updated Western and sort of developed mentality, especially in the 18th century Viennese court, but at the same time some of the territories that were controlled, if not most of them, were particularly, say, poor compared to the, say, European average, at least quantitatively speaking. So this would be used like also to different degrees and different strategies. The Habsburgic central location, as we've seen, rendered them in part isolated in the early modern era from majorly threatening enemies that would have likely sort of even speeded up the compaction of an Austrian state especially. But at the same time, and exactly because of this, the Habsburgic frontier were sort of very easy to penetrate. All right. There were also literally different sources of civilizational practices. From one side, the Habsburgs drew from Germany, from the other, Italy. And so, as we will see, the Habsburgs achieved a considerable degree of success in the respective areas, but at the same time, keeping to develop on this sort of more local pre-existing system than transforming their dominion into a highly centralized, for the time standards, concentrated, let's put it in this way, absolute monarchy. Right? This was a blessing or a curse, depending on how you see it, since the time of Maximilian and Ferdinand. So when you look in perspective, for example, at countries like France, Sweden, Brandenburg, Prussia, and Russia, you realize that their, for example, territorial aggressiveness was much more pronounced. Why? Because they essentially had, depending on the powers here, some were radically underdeveloped, like Russia, or in Sweden, say at the beginning at least of their journey. Brandenburg, Prussia as well. France instead was a major power, like essentially the most developed state as we really intended, even though, say, superficially was still a certain sort of feudal monarchy, sometimes relatively anachronistic, but capable of actually stepping further and being actually the first enemy of Austria throughout this time, at least until the times of Louis XV, Madame de Pompadour, etc. The 7 Years' War, etc. The word new, especially towards this latter end, of course, you can appreciate how the Habsburgic Empire compacts with more defined borders. Like from one side you have the Prussians, from another you have the Russians, from another side, like the Ottoman frontier sort of relatively stabilizes, from the other you have like at least the French a bit more distant. Let's say it's the spheres of influence come to at some point not just to overlap but naturally to define more neatly these boundaries. And yet you realize that although the Habsburgs had sort of even strokes of luck, for example, think about the Polish partitions, even though the Habsburgs got the worst of it, like the single most underdeveloped part of Poland went to them. It was also the much more poorly administered also in Habsburgic times. You see that they hardly launched themselves into major, say, territorial adventures, conquests. Even what Prince Eugen, for example, manages to get at some point is lost. There is like just a natural expansion, I would say, consolidation of a power that was well founded, well elaborated, exactly through this local management, micromanagement at some point. That projects, in fact, Austria to this other position of being a massive power, but being in many ways also devoid of particularly large potential. Right. For example, at the thresholds of World War I, we would say what was the least technologically advanced European power, military speaking? It was the Austria-Hungary. Right. Even the Italians had actually more technological capacity. Why? Because largely the Habsburgic Empire was, in fact, from a side of Europe that was, it still is, much less developed, except for again the German part, than the rest, right? And developing mostly until Eastern Europe, even with Galicia. I made a video about that, and therefore having also to do that. This is something, at least on Schwerpunkt, I've always tried to be extremely clear about, because people seem to have this strangely archetypal idea for which, I don't know, the greatest differences in Europe are between the North and the South. Actually, still today, like the greatest difference is by far between the West and the East. And the Habsburgs are straddling this territory. Again, they have the highly advanced Lombardy, but they have also the sort of quite depressed Galician area. They have, and I'm talking, of course, in comparison to these extremes. And the question is, what kind of future, even, you would expect a Maria Theresia, Joseph II, a France, like even a Franz-Joseph, even, that's actually the biggest question, the most painful existential, figure, like to properly seeing that man, the greatness of that older traditional world really dying completely out. And bear in mind that the Central Powers are, plus Russia technically, really are the last place in which sort of the Middle Ages finish historically. Right? In France, it finished at the end of the 18th century. There's nothing really to be proud of in historical perspective. It's not like that, I don't know, the Russian Middle Ages were particularly, say, since it was more backwards, it was more traditional. No, right? But what I mean is that we're all fascinated, let's be honest, with the Habsburgic Empire because of the magic that this sort of almost unspoiled lands of Mitteleuropa, with their legions, with their folklore, with their blood. I mean, think even about, I don't know, I personally very much love Bram Stoker's Dracula, even though the author didn't understand absolutely anything about Romanian history. But the setting, the frame, that sense of the step of the Slavs, of this sort of more medieval-like and sort of exquisitely folk, but also depressed and terrible and sort of obscure and primitive reality really speaks to our soul in a way that, yes, it's like looking into, in that work, of course, there is this staunch contrast between Victorian England, London, right, the single most developed place ever at that point, and, the Carpathians, right? And that's exactly what you can sort of see, right, even if you compare the latter to Vienna, for example. I made a video, by the way, about that this Weltburg is nashed by Gustav Meyring, which is, by the way, also a masterpiece of sort of Hermeticism or occultism that takes place in Prague during World War I, and there is that Habsburgic vibe in there, that aristocratic divide. And still, it may, if you don't know what's the context, you start reading the book, this could be, I don't know, the 18th century, not the beginning of the 20th, because the world had sort of stopped there, in those places at the time. And just think also, that's the most terrifying thing, what socialism did to these places. It literally erased and sort of zeroed that sort of mentality and tradition and capacity of preservation. It's a major disaster. It's really terrible to see when, say, that's why I make the distinction at the beginning between traditionalism and conservatism. Today people think that, I don't know, post-socialist countries, more tradition there, because they confuse like being opposed just to insane leftistic lunacy being traditional. That's not what traditional means, right? These countries are barely conservative in that sort of Western plenitude. Like, there's actually much more tradition within the broader pile of, of just output, even of extremely negative things that you can find in West, than anything there's there. They're being probably raised, right? Socialism does not, you don't emerge from socialism normal for a long time, not decades or probably even centuries. There is something insanely traumatic and surgically removed probably from your brain. And this is also, by the way, a proof that, in fact, everybody has lost an idea of what tradition is. There is no country in the world today that is actually aware, but it's not been for a very long time. It's not like, I don't know, even in the 18th century, the average masses of the Habsburgic Empire lived freely and happily in tradition. No, right? The fall of mankind, the degeneration at times had severely struck, right? Again, people think that tradition doesn't have to do with power. It really does have. And the fact that these areas were less developed, as they were also in previous times, since ever, actually, and there's a deep sort of track of that, is also something we can't quite unsee, nor that actually qualifies positively anything about that. But I like to be harsh in this criticism, because I really think that the major reason why we still don't believe, at least in a world of conservatives, it would be the sort of the lowest form of, say, proto-traditional acceptability by incredibly fallen standards, is that truly conservatives do not, in fact, really know what this all is about, right? They lack the most fundamental political, historical, cultural references. They make up imaginary pasts, imaginary countries, imaginary histories for essentially comforting their own, very often self-sabotaging, but also comforting their own weaknesses, their own fears, not really going out there and seeing what, for example, lay within the Habsburgic monarchy, conceptually, metaphysically, tradition. We'll see this better, of course, in especially medieval history videos. It's not just about the Habsburgs specifically, but the institution, all right? So the exposure, actually, of the Habsburgic domains, this is the point that we were making, to foreign interference, it was very high. And this is true a bit for everybody, but it is also true that, again, the particular institutional form of the Habsburgic Empire, the level of development of its communities, sort of the geographical pattern that it consolidated, allowed such interference to be more vicious, being characterized at least by a greater degree of permeability compared to other countries. Meaning, I don't know, France could really interfere much more directly in the Habsburgic affairs, causing, say, domestic strife than Austria could do with France. Even though France was, in many ways, a leviathan with enormous wings, but at large, it was also depending on its own might, right? It could be surely sort of pushed by the external forces, but this could also and would bounce back. Look what happened to Austria during Napoleonic Wars, but also that in this sense could be interfered by other powers like Britain. This is actually like we are on the same scale, really, but it's also important to of course think how the difference that existed between a, say, global power navally wise and, say, in fact, a strongly continental one like the Habsburgic one. I mean, Russia was more dependent on the sea than the Habsburgs were. A great reason, definitely, of the substantially unfinished, right, efforts towards power concentration and territorial control from the Habsburgic side were due to such foreign intervention that destabilized the system, that prevented this or that community to simply, go with Habsburgic rule limpidly and consuming resources in the process. And so this failure ultimately compels the Habsburgs to shape their domestic and foreign policies in ways that definitely set them apart from other major powers on the continent. Even until the very end of the monarchy, during the raging of the Great War, the later regimes formed after the dissolution of the Doppelmonarchie experimented with the central administration, clinging to the hope that by reorganizing it in various ways they might achieve through subtle adjustment what they had failed to accomplish with genuine reforms. And as we know, like, the collapse of Austria-Hungary historically was, see, too often it's said this thing had to crumble because it was just an anachronistic relic of a feudal past or whatever. But nobody focuses on how Europe would have, say, this again, I don't like what ifs, but aside from the fact that surely the Austro-Hungarians had grown ever more dependent on the Germans. But think about, like, for example, the geopolitical theories that are really in their determinism devoid of concreteness, but how geopolitics was being developed pseudo-scientifically, at least in the 19th century, and the realization that the area that is basically today's Poland, Baltic countries, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldavia would be crucial in control just for anyone that wants to dominate over Europe in terms of manpower, resources. Of course, things changed since then, but say the concreteness of European development somehow still passes through that balance. And that's why, for example, during the Cold War, the Warsaw Pact had the upper hand, right? Whereas today, NATO has the upper hand, because exactly those areas, albeit contested, are still part of a balance where, in fact, who has the upper hand belongs to the West at large, even within it. And so it's ever more important to sort of focus on it and settling also the matter for good. And this pertains, however, to another... we don't talk too much about Eastern Europe also because definitely I made a series about Ukrainian history. I haven't been talking much about Russian one. It's not like I'm trying to obscure some chapters of European history. I just think that aside from the reasons that could could make you wait about talking a bit more in a detached way. Of course, there is so much to learn even just about the single specificities. How much have you thought of the Habsburgic role in this kind of, let's say, balance role? Definitely the Habsburgs are not quite literally the most important country there, in fact, but how different outcomes historically could have generated sort of different plans, different strategies, different allies. We'll talk about the Schlieffen plan soon, probably, too, so that can be also better perspective to a degree. There is about the idea of Austrian clemency, the sense of an Habsburgic growing inclination to govern by consensus, right? The sense that remains even ceremonially until the very last days of the empire of, say, representatives from the various communities of the Dominion having the right of presenting themselves in front of the emperor dressed in their traditional attire. The respect towards these communities, their customs, and their, say, contribution to the monarchy, and their balance between themselves. You know how, I don't know, the Magyars were essentially the ones who were pushing the most. They hated basically everybody, and they were hated in turn. We've seen it in the video about Galicia, by the way. We've seen it, say, how, for example, certain autonomies were fostered in that region by the Habsburgs exactly to allow for a counterbalance of actually also a large mass of people to counter other nationalities. It's actually a very complicated story, especially towards the 19th century. It gets heavy because that's when actually the Habsburgs start to lean themselves towards some sort of, not really ethnic cleansing, but the idea that they had to push for, say, the particular nationalization of this or that group. The registers were at some point mirroring that there's at least being altered. There's a fork. There were shady things that, of course, mirrored the tension of an empire that felt like everything was about to fall apart, hence more autonomy is being given. So you must understand it in that very specific context. It's not, let's say, you can express a moral merit in this, positively or negatively, but you first of all must understand its context. Otherwise, what's the point of judging there? There's nothing wrong in judging historically, but you have to do it if you know the history. So let's take our time for that. And recognizing that they could not entirely diminish the uniqueness of their territories, overcome the influence of the feudal nobility, we're talking about also previous centuries here, the Habsburgs sought to gain support by being mindful of these elites' political rights, social privileges, and economic needs. Just comparatively, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth sort of collapsed because of, for example, the failure of recognizing a Ruthenian element within it. Ukraine was essentially playing the same game. That's also why they ended mostly largely into Galicia in part, and also in the Tsarist Empire from the other. But that sort of sclerosis that happened especially in the oligarchic establishment of the Commonwealth, while the kings were trying to be a bit more constructive, well, it's something that the Habsburgs did manage to avoid. And this is actually a great proof of civilization. because again, in hindsight, yes, it did sort of prepare the demise of the empire. It was definitely a compromise. If the Habsburgs had had the capacity to simply bend everybody and everyone, they would have done it. But since they couldn't, at least they played it cleverly, and they managed to foster, after all, a sense of belonging that to some great extent did go beyond such national divides. And everything was sort of fucked up towards the end because, as we were saying before, I don't know, the Austrians were buying into Germanism, and in that particularly nationalistic, suprematistic point of view, and this opposed them even more against the Hungarians, and vice versa. By the way, it was happening everywhere in Europe. This is not to accuse specifically a people or another, but that's in of itself the symptom, the consequence, and also the cause of the disgregation of traditional values, right? That up to this point had sort of held, right? So one could reflect also on the responsibility of the rulers, because that's traditionally where you have always to look at. But of course, it is also at this point in history, considering power distribution, a great matter of the failure of the respective peoples, right? I mean, Austria is a pretty nice place to live today, but if you look at historical perspective, how much they could control at some point, what they're reduced to now, essentially to the same scale of countries like, at least in a geographic, like the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary. Even for these, I mean, look at Hungary. It was essentially an empire in the Middle Ages, and now it's all eaten up in that. And so it's really it's really frustrating, right? It's one of the saddest actual visions in history, and it speaks to about a collective failure, for which, by the way, the some general questions are still open, right? Think about the Balkan question. Well, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, were the ones that, in spite of all issues, had sort of kept the thing together. Then you can argue it's not resolved even to this day, at least, not to much consequence, because I would say that things now are settled, and nobody really needs anything to break out there anymore. But there are big questions that it's as if history went faster than governments, I mean, that, say, mankind itself could adapt to it, right? And so if one doesn't really learn history, or learns it in that sort of incredibly narrow-minded, literally limited, right, in actual amount of knowledge way, very often limited to the same local history, like there's no way to understand the whole issue. So while the aforementioned approach compromised the central government ability to effectively integrate its diverse dominions, it encouraged the Habsburgs to negotiate agreements with the most powerful social and national groups, often at the expense of those deemed less likely to threaten domestic stability. There were some communities that were sacrificed in this regard. Nonetheless, such compromises proved, as we've seen, like over the centuries, in hindsight, substantially beneficial, right? Had they sort of tried the other way, they would have likely not imploded, at least consumed an incredible amount of resources that we're trying instead to salvage. This is, economics is not really a way to see history completely, but think from a military point of view how of all the difficulties we have seen to actually mobilize, to recruit an army, right, in the first place. Well, it's not like the Habsburgs were saying, okay, well, we just have to be nice. They didn't have the means to impose enough levies for that, right? So the best way was trying to sort of freeze everything, keeping to work from the within, trying not to destabilize, say, the what was not to be destabilized, and substantially say, hoping that nothing wrong would really happen. This is even how the Habsburgs found themselves in 1683, like literally thinking that the Ottomans would have not attacked or something, because at the end of the day, well, okay, they were habituated with all false alarms, but there was a level of of paralysis almost that actually the crisis contributed to surpass, because that's really after like the campaigns against the Turks, after the siege, that Austria becomes a fully fledged regional power. Like in the second half of the 16th century, Austria had this dynastic crisis. It sort of came back almost to fragment, so losing the power it had at the beginning of the 16th century, comparatively to the other states that also were growing, were less powerful the century before. But it's only in the 18th century, actually, with Maria Theresa's reforms, that you have a decent army, for example, being fully mobilized, and say how the Louis XIV had already done in the second half of the 17th century. Admittedly, the first in Europe to be a truly modern national army. And the same for Prussia, by the way. So this is very interesting to see in perspective. Yet, as we've seen, like there were ways of, say, allying oneself with the local estates and feudality, so reducing internal unrest and secure cooperation in achieving crucial dynastic goals. In many ways, it was about cooptation and the avocation. Mostly, it was the idea of, okay, we will pay taxes in order not to have, as it historically was, like the army billeted in our homes. And this would facilitate actually also the tax collection system, the smoothing of such process, and the compaction of a steady flow of resources provided to the state that was ever more powerful in terms of deterrence and more, so that the subject would also feel more protected, not just sort of being imposed much. So, of course, it was much historically, as in every country, but realistically, it was also about a lot of inertia, as always. Like, people tend to be, they could do really much more than they actually do. So, the necessity of reaching a consensus among the ruling elites, however, was in itself an hindrance to the government's capacity to implement domestic reforms or pursue justice, but also restricted its autonomy in conducting warfare, as we observed. So that's a great reason why it's not like the resources weren't there. These countries were particularly underdeveloped. I mean, look at Russia. Definitely was the least developed country of all, but say by political compaction, so a particular internal balance, it would become a great power. Here, the situation was more civilized. People means, of course, to cope with emergential situations, and the idea was, okay, let's keep our control on it as long as it's not needed, because otherwise it would just give such resources that the dynasty the rulers will become too strong and will be able just to control us more directly. So the limitation stemmed from the fact that these elites retained control over the financial resources necessary to support a large army. And so this meant the Habsburgs were unlikely to initiate aggressive wars, mostly for this reason. Not because they were, pacifistic power. They were kinder or less, violent than combative than the Prussians by temper. I don't know. It was mostly an issue due to their awareness of the monarchical military vulnerabilities and the difficulties they faced in persuading their diverse dominions to make the requisite sacrifices. And so when we look at the more impulsive or aggressive powers, of also the more autocratic and sort of also built up, depending on talking about statally powers like France, Brandenburg, Prussia, or Russia, you realize that essentially these powers were less dependent on securing popular domestic support. And historically, it's not really much of a positive thing. Like if you want to look at the so-called liberal reforms of the 18th century in Austria, and so this idea of like having even gone too far, and to a European scale, contributing to foster those ideas that definitely were not, say, the Habsburgs, but that would push towards this liberalization as far as the masses, as the revolution was concerned, so the anti-traditional ideas were concerned. You can understand how there was, of course, a price they paid, but in a way this system became also more civil historically. I mean, you can argue that a great part of Central Europe was definitely civilized by the Austrian government, and that, yes, there was a price to pay as far as less power was concerned, but there was also, from the other side, a price to pay for developing as autocratic regimes, in which people were ever more subjected and sort of incapable of investing, of developing. Think about Russia in particular, and say that collapsed before the Habsburgic Empire, evidently. So, and with which outcome, by the way? I mean, traditionally speaking, that's the disaster. I made a video about the abomination of the Soviet Union, the human abomination of the Soviet Union, that explains to you in a traditional lens what that's really about. So, from a military point of view, that sort of milder appearance is confirmed, because unlike France and Prussia that developed essentially some sort of militaristic direction, even though the Habsburgic army was not that bad at all, you understand that it wouldn't set, the latter wouldn't set really the gold standard of European military culture. Essentially, France maintained always that. This is interesting because, again, France is a major landmass, so this is very similar to the Habsburgic one, apparently, in need to have a hell of a army, of a land force, and in fact, in the French case, would set the gold standard of European military culture. Prussia literally had to survive because it was surrounded by land enemies, and it sort of increased its sort of qualitative it's militarism. It's exploiting, by the way, much of this, again, crude, primitive resources that it had, but it also had to grow over time into something bigger. So you would think, however, that Austria was to develop something that we would remember as similarly. Probably the Habsburgic army is underrated. We will see it in other videos, and they knew how to beat right hard. But at the same time, we don't get the sense of a particular stability of the Austrian frontiers, for that matter, at least the Habsburgic ones. This is relevant because of also sort of Austria wouldn't have really a Vauban, right? So limits were often due to the backwardness of its neighbors, for example, like the Ottomans or even the Russians, than the general, let's say, solidity of its defenses. In fact, at some point, Austria does become dependent on other powers. We've seen, the war of the Third Coalition, and that's something that definitely stands out in the annals of military history, which is also naturally one in which Austria does not emerge pretty well. I made a series about this, by the way, so there you understand how the spaces were becoming too crowded to an extent, how sort of complicated also it was to control the spaces. In any case, more defense than offense. Again, the Prussians mobilized, created their forces for the sake of offending before anybody could offend them and enter the land, which was also relatively easy. If it hadn't been for the miracles of the House of Brandenburg, right, Prussia would have been probably also quite resized as a nation, would have changed sort of everything. The French also had like a hell of a defensive capacity, but also a hell of an offensive one, and that's why also Austria and her allies contributed with these coalitions to try to stem it, and in fact succeeding, but not alone as such. And so there were all these various, as you understand, I'm referencing to different times, different examples. But this aspect of the more formidable or aggressive foes would not be a model for the Habsburgic military culture. It's sort of irrelevant. Such offensive would have sort of undermined international status quo and the balance of power that the Habsburgs were so meticulously weaving. Hence the beautiful hexameters in Latin that you should pronounce every time you visit Vienna. Bella gerant alii, tu felix Austria nube, namque Mars alis dat tibi diva Venus. Right, so that this is the Austria in all her supreme beauty and love, is to say, the wars are fought by others. You, Austria, happy Austria, Austria felix, right? Mary, right? In fact, that which to others Mars gives, to you, Venus, the goddess Venus, gives. And this is true because, as you know, the Austrians were also quite prolific. They married their princesses all over, and in this sense, they had, not just a great dynastic continuity, but a great capacity to intervene, like to become like to be a European-wide sort of leverage, right? This was really relevant with extremely painful consequences at a time, such as the beheading of Marie Antoinette. But that's exactly how risky of a business this whole thing was. That's how much at stake really existed, and you wouldn't understand it otherwise. Naturally, by joining such mostly defensive coalitions, the emperor had to pursue only those objectives that aligned with his allies' interests as well, which was complicated. And of course, Austria went on the offensive on multiple occasions. But he was doing so mostly to either defend a territory, just acquired one that they had some rights on, and or with some general coalition always, and with the intention to restore essentially a balance, right? Not even necessarily a peaceful one per se, but one that would not, of course, squeeze her too much, would not destabilize this territory, would keep her hinterland, say, safe from enemies that would have to fight in other theaters, not that one as well. Also, this was a compromise, generally willing to accept return for the domestic and international support of the elites, because these did not want, as we've seen, to pay much for a more aggressive policy, and therefore the emperor also bent to that partially. So an Habsburgic dominion that relied on consensus among its domestic factions also increasingly depended on the agreement with European powers to achieve its foreign policy aims, which is definitely not a good outcome. And this is evident already during the Napoleonic Wars, right? The diplomatic strategies of the Habsburgs, which would later become associated with Metternich, such as a coalition building, balance of power diplomacy, the preservation of legitimate borders. These were not just, again, a 19th or 20th century thing. It was really already visible as early as the 17th century that we will be looking at quite soon. And understanding in this sense better also the strategies we will observe, for example, in the 30 Years' War. Today we didn't focus much on that sort of German interventionism that the Habsburgs really had in their veins to some degree, but both in the 16th and in the 17th century would be beaten, especially as far as her imperial dignity was concerned. In the 18th century, we have this massive shift east because of the crumbling of the Ottoman Empire on that frontier after 1683. Something that goes on until the first decades of the 18th century. That's also essentially the moment in which the empire, the Ottoman Empire enters a severe crisis, starts becoming itself dependent on other powers, Austria included, which is also like that's the Balkan, especially the Straits scenario, is definitely also one of the most debatable as far as the power balance in Europe and in the world was really concerned. Then in the 19th century, we have like the Napoleonic Wars that are sort of, aside from the strictly political and military events, definitely undermining the traditional, let's say, consensus on which these older powers were based. The Holy Roman Empire does not exist anymore. And actually, Austria-Hungary is a powerful polity that is really, a might to be reckoned with, but at the same time is starting to lag behind the most sort of, modernized countries further, and especially the German unification brings to this dependency of the Habsburgs on the Hohenzollern to some degree. There is a war. That's how properly Austria-Hungary, as you know, was born. Before it was just like Austria, the Austrian Empire. And so then we know how it ended. But just for saying how complicated really things really are, but how composite and sort of tasty overall like this kind of history really is, like how much you can really draw from the general let's say the general picture about an empire that continued to exist so much and around, again, places that were not even particularly developed or particularly competitive, but it still maintained together that capacity, that critical mass, that force, right? And that cannot be simply unseen or disregarded. And so I think that this, as far as Habsburgic history is concerned, is really it's really one of the most important things to acknowledge. Of course, in this series I will try to celebrate the Habsburgic Empire for what it really was, in fact, in hindsight, and realizing how sort of how much we owe as Europeans to this power, even when, again, many of us seem, in fact, even as a consequence of the collapse of this empire, so sort of even distrustful at the idea, or having apparently to buy into it as some sort of not necessarily even Austrian nationalism, but Habsburgic myth that, in fact, has been heavily criticized, is a much creepier and subtler sense of Black Legion, or this negative one towards the Habsburgic Empire that there is, especially for the last couple of centuries of its existence, than for the Spanish one that we were talking about before. In essentially stressing how backwards or anachronistic or doomed to collapse or whatever this system would have allegedly been. And this is not nice, right? But at least it should be much better circumstantiated and understood in relation especially also to the peoples that existed, because evidently, as we just pointed out, this wasn't just like, I don't know, or simply an Austrian empire, unless you totalized sort of the degree of control that Austria per se just as a power could be. There's no doubt that it's not even Austria alone, as you know. It's a group of larger German possessions that, yes, did this substantially, but that also necessitated of, again, how many Italian or Czech or Hungarian soldiers you find in the 17th century, in the 18th. Like, you have there really, even, for example, the relative countries of these nationalities have sort of not even studied so much that military history, because it was in the times in which at least part of them was under the Habsburgs, right? And so that's also something that affects, even indirectly to this day, for what was done during the 19th and 20th century when these countries broke free. How it affected the historiographical production at the time. And instead we're missing a huge chunk of extreme military culture in terms of the Europeanness of it. And that's also why I planned for this autumn to make more videos probably about the Habsburgic military history, probably also the one of the empire, as it was felt by most of these subjects, and the Holy Roman Empire. All right, and that's a bit of a forgotten reality, a bit of a sort of overlooked one. Very well. So this was sort of the more conceptual presentations of Habsburgic history. We will really dive, I can tell you, deep into this histories. It's never like as deeply as I would like, because this history is really, really something. But I'm just checking here how many videos I made about. Nah. Oh. Well, 25. Yeah, because most of them are from the siege of Vienna, and also the war of the Third Coalition. More recently, we've made more Habsburgic stuff, and that's cool. That's really cool. That's where I wanted the channel to get, and so everything will blend perfectly again. I have a lot of stuff incoming on the 30 Years' War that I hope you will like. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.